your seat. And as you do, go ahead and grab your Bible. And if you want to follow along in your notes, you can do that by grabbing the outline that's in your bulletin there. So as we come back now to Hebrews chapter 11, and our study that's a familiar chapter about faith, we are studying a book that's brought us there, and we don't need really to spend much time other than I have to think of something that was said this morning in one of those songs that kind of reminds me again of how important it is for us to remember that Jesus is better. This book here is talking about how much better Jesus is. It's outlined by reminding us about the person of Jesus, the first 6 chapters, and then about the priesthood of Jesus in the second section, chapter 7 through 10. And I don't know about you, but there are times in my life as a believer that just like that song we just sang, I will have to say, Lord, help my heart believe that. Are you ever like that? I mean, some people, when they encounter those struggles and the circumstances and the situations, they don't even want to address that possibility in their heart. But even like we're going to learn this morning in the life of Moses, he knew there was a pleasure in sin, right? There was an allurement that can draw us. And it's like the sirens just calling, come, come, come. And it's those moments we need to really remember and pray and understand what the writer of Hebrews is saying, that Jesus is better. Help my heart to believe that. Not just to say it with my mouth, not believe it just in my head, but to really in my heart embrace that and pursue that and be totally satisfied with him. So to show us what that really looks like, to have a person like Jesus who is better and a priest who is interceding for us in heaven above, one of the things that he is doing is he is representing us and interceding for us so that we might faithfully run the race. And so Hebrews 11, as we've been studying in the last section, shows us what it looks like to run this race. The last section, or I should say the second section of the book of Hebrews, starts giving us illustration and example after example of those who show us what it looks like to be children of faith, to run the race. Starts out like Abel believing that if we come by the only sacrifice, God's Son, Jesus, and we come through that means of worship, we'll be saved. And then we begin now a relationship with God through Christ. We see that faith goes on to be like Enoch, where it walks with God, it fellowships with him, it wants to please him and seeks him truly as they continue in this journey. We learned in the life of Noah how that the work of faith is something God calls all of us to do. It may not be building a boat, but we are called to serve him. You know, we're not called to just sit back and soak in and sour. We're called to really just pour ourselves out completely to the work that God gives us to do. And I can promise you, it's not going to take you 120 years, and God is not going to give you 120 years to do that. You don't have that many years. But be like Noah and give yourself to the work that God calls us to do. Then we looked at Abraham, who is this most incredible example, a worthy example of what real faith looks like. Real faith ultimately comes to this place as you walk with him and you learn to work and serve him, where you will be willing and ready to give up any and everything, the dearest thing that God calls you to. And then finally, last week, we looked at Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. These are the ones who now in Hebrews 11 are at the end of their lives. They are dying. And it showed us and taught us what it means to pass on our faith successfully to those who come after us. That's what we want to do. Now that brings us to where we are this morning in Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to be looking at verses 23 through 28. And if you've already glanced at your Bible and you've looked at your notes, you know that the next person in the lineup in this chapter on faith is, who is it? Yeah, it's Moses. Very familiar character in the life of God's people. And here's what we're going to learn about Moses. Through Moses, like the others, he wants to speak to us and teach us something about the life of faith. And here's what I'm calling it. He is a story about the wealth of faith pursued. In other words, what is it if you really are like Moses? What do you choose to pursue? What do you seize? What do you value? What do you really want to grab hold of? I know probably everyone in this room has heard the Latin phrase before, carpe diem, right? You've heard that, seize the day. And I was thinking about that this morning, literally around 4 o'clock this morning when I woke up and I got going, and I was thinking about the movie Dead Poets Society. You remember that movie? Robin Williams is playing Mr. Keating, and Mr. Keating says to the class, having had them read a poem on the brevity of life, he says this: "We are food for worms, lads, because believe it or not, each and every one of us in this room is one day going to stop breathing, turn cold, and die." Then he points to a black and white set of pictures of former students and athletes and says this: "These boys are now fertilizing daffodils. But if you listen real close, you can hear them whisper their legacy to you. Carpe," he whispers. "Carpe diem. Seize the day, boys. Make your lives extraordinary." And we've all heard that phrase. We've seen the movie. But I can be honest with you. I know a lot of people who have seized the day and would never fit in the category of Moses. Because there's another Latin word that I think really we ought to jack it up to beyond just seize the day. Because you could seize the day, make a name for yourself, make all the money, do all the things you want to do in life, lay hold of things, and never really be like Moses. That Latin word I'd like to suggest to you would be this: carpe aeternum. Carpe aeternum. What is that? That's seize eternity. Lay hold of that which is ahead of us and before us. If you're going to give yourself to something, lay hold of that which never passes away. And as you know, and as we've read before in this passage about Moses, that's exactly what he does. He is willing to lay aside the wealth and the riches and the best of the best in this world, that he might be someone who seizes eternity. Now, I want you to think about this for just a moment. For some people, when it comes to life, those are the kind of people who end up losing it all in life. Moses, in contrast, is the guy who leaves it all, just walks away from it. I was thinking about that contrast of people losing it all, and was reminded of a guy by the name of William Durant. Anybody know who William Durant is? Ever heard that name? Well, you may not know his name, but I bet you know his story. It's the story of a man who was a part of the winning and losing cycle in the 1800s, or I should say the 1900s, when automobiles started to come into existence. He was the one who before that had a carriage business, and he finally rescued really the car making industry from bankruptcy by taking on all the other industries that were trying to start up and putting them together. So Billy Durant actually started a corporation called General Motors. In 1905, he rescued financially a car maker from bankruptcy by the name David Buick. And he would form a partnership with Buick, and together they would create an empire by buying out smaller car companies, also named after the founders' names, like Ransom Olds of the Oldsmobile Company, a man named Walter Chrysler. Billy Durant teamed up with a French automaker named Louis Chevrolet. Then a French Canadian joined the group who named his company in honor of his ancestor's last name, who was Cadillac. At one point, Henry Ford agreed to sell his young automotive plant to Billy Durant, but Henry Ford refused stock options in General Motors and insisted on cash instead. Smart guy, right? They finally agreed on a price, but Billy Durant missed the closing deadline, and Henry Ford changed his mind, which, of course, changed the course of automotive history. Over the next few decades, Durant and his partners made a fortune. In fact, I read that more than 70 men became millionaires by joining or supplying General Motors, and that was in the early 1990s. But here is where the story takes the turn in Billy Durant's life. Billy Durant would lose his fortune and regain it and then lose it again. His last attempt at car making ended in bankruptcy on the eve of the Great Depression. And here's how his life ends. In 1936, this ingenious creator of a billion-dollar industry was penniless, managing a bowling alley in Flint, Michigan. In fact, before he and his original partner, David Buick, died, they were too poor to own one of the tens of thousands of automobiles they had actually created. That's what you call going not from rags to riches, but from riches to rags. He's an example of someone who lost it all in the world. And Moses is what? Just the opposite. Moses is not a man who lost it all. Moses was a man who could have had it all. And yet he chose to leave it all and walk away from it. And you'll discover that's a unique key feature about the life of Moses. So let's look at our text here in chapter 11, verses 23 through 28. Now, I want to just tell you and warn you that these 7 verses that are here cover 120 years of Moses' life. Don't worry, it's not going to take me that long to get through the 7 verses. But what the writer of Hebrews does is he condenses 120 years of Moses' life to just 7 verses. And you'll notice as we read through the text here that those verses are broken up by the phrase, by faith, by faith, by faith. In fact, those four times that he says by faith gives us, as it were, 4 summary chapters about the life of Moses for 120 years. So let me read them for you and follow along and notice what it describes about him. By faith, verse 23, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God rather than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them. So did you see in that text that there are 4 times he says by faith? He says it in verse 23, by faith. Verse 24, by faith. Verse 27, by faith. And verse 28, by faith. And that summarizes 4 chapters, if you will, of his life. And I'm going to walk you through those chapters this morning. And then I want to end our time really challenging us to think about whether Jesus really is enough for us. Is he really what satisfies us? Can we say that's what really my heart is pleased and happy and content with? So let's walk through this. First chapter of his life is found in verse 23. And I'm calling this chapter the chapter of the preservation of his life by faith. Look at it again at verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, I want you to think about his parents for just a moment. Now, their names are Amram and Jochebed, and you'll find out that they're his parents when you come to Exodus chapter 6 in the Old Testament. Remember, the writer is condensing a lot of his life down to 7 verses, and in this verse here, when he talks about their parents, this is who he's talking about, Amram and Jochebed. Now, somebody, just so you won't get a little confused here, you'll say, now, wait a minute. Moses was born in Exodus chapter 2, and it says his parents are Amram and Jochebed in Exodus chapter 6. Now, what was going on there? Were they somehow living together or something like that, had a kid, and they decided to get married? The answer is no. The timeline looks like this. In chapter 2, it talks about his parents. It just doesn't give their names. When you come to chapter 6 and you have the genealogy, that part you usually jump over, right? When you're reading the Old Testament, you're just faithfully trying to read through the Bible, but that doesn't matter to you at all. You just jump and go on, right? It's those sections you think that only God and their mama really care about, right? So that chapter is just giving the genealogies of the families, and there's where we learn who his mom and dad truly are, Amram and Jochebed. And here's what you should be struck with as you read Hebrews 11, verse 23. Moses isn't even in the picture yet, right? It's really more about the faith of his mom and his dad at this point. So the king then, as you know, back in then, and this is where the story is highlighting in verse 23, is a king named Pharaoh. Remember, before Moses and them, there was a Joseph who liked, or there was a Pharaoh, I should say, who liked Joseph. But then there arose another Pharaoh who didn't like the children of Israel. Didn't know Joseph, didn't like the children of Israel. And you will remember that this king had made a law that any Jewish boy who was born was to be killed. What the law was for those Jewish people. They were slaves in the land. Now, what did they do? Well, you remember the story. They didn't kill their kids. They just kept having babies. And so what happened is that then the king made an edict and a decree where he said anybody, Jew or Gentile, who knows about any baby boys being born here, you have to take them and throw them in the Nile River. And so from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23, let's look at how he words this part of the chapter of Moses' life. He says, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents. So for 3 months, what they have done, they actually put him some way in a secrecy, in a seclusion, hoping that nobody would hear that baby. Now, why did they do that? Well, the next part of the verse just sums it like this. Because they saw that he was a beautiful child. Now, that just seems like, I read that, I thought, well, absolutely the mom and daddy's going to think he's a beautiful child. I've never met anybody who didn't think their kid was beautiful. And we know some of them are not, right? But they're beautiful to them. They're beautiful to grandparents. And, you know, sometimes you just wonder when you look at sometimes babies. That's none of y'all's babies out here, though. By the way, none of your babies. You think you just want to say something like that, like, well, now you got yourself a baby, right? You just don't know what to say sometimes. And so you look at this and you think, this seems obvious to say that he was beautiful. I mean, yes, he's beautiful in the eyes of mom and dad. But obviously, that's not why it's put in the Bible. It's not in divine inspiration just so we can say, see, mom and dad really think their kids are beautiful. There's got to be something more to the story. John Calvin, the reformer who wrote this, Moses was evidently marked by something out of the ordinary, although we never are told what it is. In other words, the Bible doesn't tell us what it was they saw about him that made him beautiful. What was it that marked him as extraordinary, something different? What was it about his life you just don't find from the Bible? Calvin says, but there must have been something because the Bible is inspired to say that they saw he was a beautiful child. Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, wrote that Amram, the father of Moses, was actually visited by God. We don't know that, but that's what Josephus says. And in that vision was informed that his son would be the promised deliverer for those in Egypt. We don't know that. We know he did become that, but we don't know if Amram knew that before. Whatever it was, Amram and Jochebed knew that God has part of a plan that he is working out, and they saw this child as important to God's purposes and plan. You see, the parents of Moses saw so much that God had given them this child. God had a purpose for this child, though they may or may not have known what it is, but they were going to make sure that whatever they did, they were going to honor God, please God, and not care what the king said. And that's the kind of tension we find ourselves in life at times, don't we? When someone tells us, well, you need to do this, you should do that. Or maybe there is even a law, and sometimes in culture and countries and places where they go against what God's word says, and we have to make up our mind, who is it that we're going to fear? Who are we going to really care most about? And it says in the text of Exodus 2 that they hid him. And it says here in Hebrews 11 that they did it for 3 months. Now, does your mom wonder when you read texts like that? I mean, I've been around some of your babies, right? And you've been around other people's babies, and I've been around grandchildren. I just don't imagine how you take a newborn and hide them for 3 months. I mean, they've got to be hurt. I mean, how do you keep a baby quiet for all that time, right? Chuck Swindoll wrote on this text, I love the humor he puts into this. He said, he remembered how their firstborn son never slept through the night for 18 very long months. He wrote, there were times when I longed for a wicker basket and the Nile River nearby. Right. So you get the picture, like we've all been there. What do you mean? I don't know. It's some supernatural thing, obviously, some unique thing that God did because he's protecting this child, because there's a purpose for it. And so they saw that, and that's why it says, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. They had such a belief, didn't they, that God gives life. They are to protect life. They should cherish life and do everything they can to never listen to a voice that tells them to go against what God calls us to do. So they made a choice about who they would fear. Can I just throw a little nugget in here for you? You know, fear is an amazing emotion that God has given us. It's like every emotion we have, there's nothing of emotions, whether it's even anger, that is of the devil. People often think of anger as that's a devil thing. Love and kindness and all that is from God. But every emotion is from God. It's what happens with the twisted, fallen, depraved heart that uses those good things that God made and uses them in ways that are not the way God intends for them to be. So take, for example, fear, right? Fear is a God-given emotion. And so that there are those things called phobias or fears that people have. And what's unique about fears is fear always controls a person and and keeps them from doing something if it's a negative type of fear, like a phobia. So if people are afraid of elevators, what do? They go up the steps, right? They don't get on elevators. If people are afraid of a plane, they don't get on the plane, right? They just don't do that. So think of fear as that which ultimately affects and controls us. In the negative sense, it's called phobias, but in the biblical sense, there's a fear in which the parents of Moses must have had, because it says they weren't afraid of, they didn't fear the king. That means they must have had a fear for someone else, and that was God. What it means is that they had such a strong respect and honor and awe of the God they belonged to, that really no matter what somebody else said, no matter what else might happen to them, in the end, he's going to control them and affect what they do. And so they were not afraid of the king's edict. Why is that? Well, that leads us to the second point here, and that is the plan that God was working out. If you go back at some point and you read in Exodus chapter 2, you'll see that what she did is she got her wicker basket and covered it with tar and pitch. Now that little word there that I've highlighted for you, tar, is not just saying like she was making it waterproof. Now, there's more to it than that. The pitch might imply that, but the tar is something that they believed that was a boiled paste, that if you put it on that, it would repel crocodiles. And when you go to the Nile River, that'd be a good thing. Particularly if you're going to put your baby in the water in a basket, you want to hopefully make sure the crocodiles stay away from your kid. In fact, the ESV translates that word tar, bitumen, which is a means in their mind, they thought, of repelling and keeping crocodiles away. And they set the basket among the reeds, it says in Exodus 2, verse 3, at the bank of the Niles. Now, I want you to hear something real carefully. None of this is an accident. None of this is just like we're just going to do this and we hope that things turn out well. Moses' parents knew that was the exact spot along the path where the daughter of Pharaoh would walk. In fact, if you go back and read the rest of the account in Exodus 2, you will notice that it says that she was going down to the Nile to take a bath. Now listen very carefully. It doesn't say she was going to take a bath in the Nile, but by the Nile. You see, they're wealthy enough, they're rich enough, they don't need to take baths in the creek or in the Nile. They have their own marble bathhouses. There would be no need for her to go there. Well, you go, well, why in the world would she go down to this water, and why would she go down to the Nile? She's got her own place to take a bath. Well, the Nile River was believed by the Egyptians, just part of the history of what was going on in their minds. And in that day, they believed that the emanating from Osiris, one of the chief gods, was something magical about the Nile River. In fact, they believed it was so powerful and magical, it could not only produce long life, but guess what? If you were infertile, you could become fertile. It just was like, it was the pill to fix the problem, right? Go down to the water, go down, and you get in this water, near this water, and you possibly will be able to now have a baby. That's what they believed. So the daughter of Pharaoh wasn't coming to the Nile with a bar of soap. No, she's coming down to the Nile because she's not concerned about getting clean, physically clean. What she's thinking about here is she wants to get a child. Maybe this will be the means that will help me to get a child. Now, God is sovereignly working all this out. Providentially, his plan is unfolding. And what Moses' parents have done is they've taken this child and they have placed him in a wicker basket. They've done their part to try to keep the crocodiles away, right? And God just leads this Pharaoh's daughter down by the water just at the right time to find a 3-month-old baby in a basket. I don't know if you're getting this, but this is just like crazy amazing, right? She goes and gets this basket, and then Miriam, Moses' sister, is standing over here to the side, and what does she do? She says, would you like me to go get a nurse? And Pharaoh's daughter says, yeah, go get one. And who does she go get? Moses' mama, right? And most historians believe that it's probably like a 12-year period she got to invest in his life and spend time with him. Now, I love this part of the story. This is part of the humor of the plan of God, I think. It amazes me he does this in our life, does this in people's all the time. Pharaoh's daughter said, what I want you to do is I want you to go down and I want you to get me a nurse and I will pay her a wage. Now, that's kind of like getting your child's allowance money, okay? That's what that's like. I mean, here is God just providing in every imaginable way. Now, what has that got to do with us? We're just starting out with his parents. There's something, I think, in the remaining chapters of his life, which we'll go rather quickly through, but there's something in the remaining chapters of his life that I think are connected to what mom and dad did at that stage of his life. They weren't afraid of the king. They feared God more. They took their efforts and their responsibilities to care for their child, to protect their child, and then they did what? Trusted in a God who was way bigger than them to work out his purpose. And isn't that a reminder to us as moms and dads that we are called to do just that? To be the kind of people who are responsible to impact and influence our children's life, to raise them. But in the end, we know that we can't make them turn out the way they should or we want them to. In the end, God is the one who does that. God is the one who is working out his purpose in their life. It's kind of like that passage, isn't it, that Paul reminds Timothy of in 2 Timothy 3:15, where he talks about him as a little boy. He says, from a child you've known the sacred writings which are able to give you the wisdom that leads to salvation through faith, which is in Christ Jesus. Where did he as a child get that from? He got it from his mother and he got it from his grandmother. So here is this picture here of them pouring into their life. They are literally giving themselves to him to make sure that they put everything they can in his life. You're saying, do you think that Moses' parents told him about this story in those 12 years? I bet you 1,000 times. Guarantee you. And how God had worked and purposely, sovereignly cared and protected for them, and how he had a purpose for them, because there's something beautiful about this child. There's something God is going to do through this child. So can I just encourage you, if you're a mom or a dad or a grandparent, don't ever underestimate what you're doing with those children. Don't underestimate it. When you read the Bible to them, when you pray with them, when you share those Bible stories, when you tell them how God had brought you to himself and how you've learned to trust him and how he provided for you and how you prayed about this and you prayed about that, and you just pass that on. You just have no idea. I have no idea what that really is going to mean going forward in their life. You see, the life of Moses, the first chapter of his life, really is about his mom and dad, by faith, being used by God to preserve him for God's purposes and God's plan. Now look at Hebrews 11, and let's go to the next verses here. And this is the second chapter of his life. And this has to do with the renunciation of something that he did. And he did it by faith, verses 24 through 26. Now, note what it says here in verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up. So now we've gone from when he was born to when he what? Grew up. So it's a whole different chapter of his life. And so he's grown up, and it says he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Exodus 2, again, back in the story, the narrative, it tells us that Pharaoh's daughter had made Moses her son, which means he was going to inherit incredible wealth. It meant he was going to have everything he wanted, because like any mom, and this mom has everything in the world you could offer your kid, he could have any and the best of all things. So she made Moses her son. In fact, in Acts chapter 7, if you make a note there and read this sometime, when Stephen in the book of Acts is preaching his sermon, he makes a reference to Moses, and it says that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he became powerful in speech and action. In other words, he had the best of the best education, best stuff. I mean, he didn't want for anything as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. But there's something you need to know about Moses here. On the outside, Moses looked like an Egyptian, spoke like an Egyptian maybe, wore clothes like an Egyptian, but on the inside, he wasn't an Egyptian at all. On the inside, he was just like Joseph, and he was just like those before whom, who's realized no matter where I am, who I am is not this stuff. Who I am is what God has done in my heart and made me. And so here Moses, by faith, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, just understand this. This is not like one day he refused and the next day he said, okay, I'm going to go back. I'll go do this. I like this stuff. I want that. No, he refused. And the tense of the verb here is that it indicates a refusal that was decisive and conclusive. I'm never going back. I'm never going to think of myself like that again. I am going to be a man who literally disowns the royal family and renounces all the incredible opportunities that are set before me. Now, why did he do that? Look at the rest of the verses there in Hebrews 11. Choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. So he made a choice, right? He chose it. There was something he wanted. He chose it. The next part of the text there says, and he considered something. So two things happened. He made a choice, and the reason he made a choice is because he considered something. That the reproaches of Christ were greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Now listen very carefully. Here is a choice, but not a blind choice. It is a choice based on riches. It's like putting the wealth of the world and all of Egypt in his hand and the riches of Christ and saying, he's a lot better. Jesus is better. He is far more. God is greater and more of a treasure than anything this world would have. How many of you have ever sung or heard that old hymn song? I bet you we might even sing it at the crusade this week. I'd rather have Jesus, right, than all the riches of this world. That's who Moses is. He sees it. He gets it. Now, for now, I just want to read those verses because I'm going to come back. I think locked in those three verses are the incredible key to what makes you choose and really consider something more valuable in Christ than anything else. I'll show you in just a moment. But let's move on to the next chapter of his life, okay? The third chapter of his life is in verse 27, and this is the chapter of separation. Verse 27. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. Wow, what a statement. Why did Moses' parents do what they did? Because they were trusting God by faith. Why did Moses renounce all the riches and all the stuff that he could have had in this world? Because he was a man who lived by faith, not by sight. Why is it that Moses now leaves Egypt? He separates himself. He doesn't just say, I really don't care about that stuff, but I'm going to stay here. No, he's leaving, and he did it not fearing the wrath of the king. For he endured as seeing him who is unseen. Now, this is just something unique about us as Christians, isn't it? That we see stuff that nobody else can really see. We taste things spiritually that nobody else has ever tasted. And this is kind of the way Moses is. I love the way Kent Hughes describes this. He says Moses was waiting for the glory of Christ, and that allowed him to endure 80 years as a nomad, just leaving Egypt and wandering in the desert. Because he tasted of something. He writes it this way. Just think what it would mean to literally see the fulfillment of our promised glory in heaven for just 60 seconds while still living on earth. Just 60 seconds, the first 15 seconds, to view the face of Christ. Then if you can tear your view away from him, which you wouldn't be able to do after 15 seconds, but if you could, then take the next 15 seconds to survey the angelic millions. Then another 15 seconds to scan the architecture of heaven. And finally, 15 seconds to scan the faces of friends and loved ones already there. That 60 seconds would change your life. Now, you're not going to get to do that. I'm not going to get to do that, right? But the picture is exactly, that's what he's saying, is that by faith I saw something. By faith I treasured something. By faith I tasted of something that was far better. And I can leave any Egypt, I can leave anything that seems so comfortable, so rewarding, so satisfying, so provisional to me. I can walk away from any of it as long as I see that. I keep my eye on that. In fact, can I tell you something? When we get through with chapter 11 in about 2 more weeks, and we open up chapter 12, you know what he's going to tell you to do? He's going to tell us to run the race looking where? Unto Jesus. This is just prefiguring it that happened in Moses. He saw it by faith. He knew that there was something of satisfaction more than Egypt. Last chapter of his life, and then we're going to wrap it up with some application. The fourth chapter of his life is about the institution of the Passover. In verse 28, look at it. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood. When it says he kept the Passover, literally the word there implies an instituting of the Passover. Because before that, remember, the children of Israel did not have a Passover. What was that? They wouldn't even have known what that was. But you remember that this takes us all the way back to Exodus again. And that eve and that night when God said that the death angel was going to pass through, and all the firstborn who don't have the blood sprinkled upon their door are going to do what? Die. It's a picture of coming judgment and coming wrath. And the only thing that saves you from that is somebody else gives their life. And so this lamb was slaughtered, this blood was shed, and it was put above the door as a reminder of when I see the blood. That's what it says in the Old Testament narrative. I will do what? Pass over you. You're going to be saved from the judgment and the wrath that is coming when I see the blood. So what did Moses do? He did what he's been learning to do all of his life. Live by faith. If God says do this and that'll save you from the wrath and the judgment that is coming, then that's what we're going to do. We're going to have a Passover. And that would become a memorial in the nation of Israel, where they would constantly remember that's how God rescued them. That's how God kept them from the judgment that came on the rest of the land of Egypt. Can I just throw a little thought in here for you? When I read in the Old Testament that when the death angel passes over, I've often wondered, who is that? I'm just going to throw you a possible suggestion out there. You know who I think the death angel is? I think that was God himself. Why do I think that? If you look at the text here that we're reading in verse 28, it says, by faith he kept the Passover so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them. There's something about God that we kind of push away, and we don't think much about this. We think of God as the rescuing, loving, sweet, gracious God, and he is, but he's also a just and furious and a righteous God. Remember, the book of Hebrews has told us earlier, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God, because he's just, he's holy, and he's righteous. Now, we love the love side, and we love all the mercy and the kindness and the grace, but there's also justice and holiness on this side. R.C. Sproul put it this way one time. He said, God has saved us from himself. And that just kind of rocks some worlds, right? Well, if he doesn't save us from himself, who does he save us from? He's the one offended. He's the one that we have pile upon pile of our sin and guilt and judgment and wrath before him. Who's going to be forgiven if he doesn't choose to satisfy his own justice and righteousness? And that's what he does. And though we don't do a Passover, right, because we're in the new covenant, we come to the table of the Lord every month, and that table is a reminder that we are saying by faith, we really believe what it's telling us. That somebody shed their blood, Jesus Christ, in our place, took the full fury wrath of God, that he might bring us to God, and that we might be reconciled to God, and that we might not ever, ever encounter the destruction of wrath and condemnation coming for a world that doesn't believe on him. That's what this was about. Well, that's the text. How are we going to apply this? How are we going to apply this? Now, I want you to sit and just listen, if you will. You might want to take a note, but I'd rather you just at this point just listen and let the truth sink into you. What is it that causes a man like Moses? What is it that will cause you as a man or a woman, young or old in the faith? What is it that will call you to renounce the riches of the world around you? What is it that will cause you to be like Moses and separate yourself unto God and leave so that you might follow him and do what he's called you to do? What will cause you to put your hope in a Passover lamb? Well, was it the teaching of his mom or his dad? Well, maybe that's part of what God used. But Hebrews 11 gives us the real ultimate reason. And it's back in verses 25 and 26. Look at them again. It says in verse 25, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasure of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Now I want you to back up and notice something. Moses didn't say there's no fun in Egypt, right? He talks about the passing pleasures. Now, so somehow as Christians, I think, sometimes want to say, sin's just a bad thing. There's just nothing good in that. And I know the outcome of that. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But nobody would go after if it was just like, this is awful, this is horrible, you don't want this. There is the allurement and the pleasure of sin that calls us all the time. G. Campbell Morgan, the great expositor, wrote nearly a century ago in his commentary on this verse, and I quote, "What a foolish thing it is to say there's no pleasure in sin, as if that'll keep somebody from finding out." Of course, he says, there are pleasures in sin. And then he refers to Gordon's hymn for the church, and he says, this is how the church has begun to sing the hymn. And this is in G. Campbell Morgan's day, years gone behind us. You know it. My Jesus, I love thee. I know thou art mine. For thee all the, what did it say? All the what? Well, you are right. You must be hanging around with G. Campbell Morgan, right? Yeah, the typical hymn says, all the follies of sin I resign. G. Campbell Morgan says, that's not what Gordon wrote. He originally wrote, for thee all the pleasures of sin I resign. But some pious soul thought it would be bad to sing about the pleasures of sin in church. And so they changed the words. I'm not going to argue over which word to use, but the point is simply this. There is a pleasure to sin. Now, here's my question for you as I wrap this up. How do you motivate yourself to not go after those pleasures? How do you motivate another brother or sister who is struggling with the pleasures of this world, the sin that's alluring them? How do you get them to forsake Egypt and pursue the invisible? How do you do that? How do you empower a person to say no to the temptations of the world, the flesh, and the devil, and yes to the things of God? How do you do that? What works best and most effectively to help people really overcome those things like addictions, worries, lust, materialism, and say, those are no attraction to me. Those are nothing I want. How do you do that? Well, let me tell you what I think the standard answers typically are. They go something like this. Now, you don't want to engage in that sort of behavior, or you'll get caught one of these days, and your reputation is going to be ruined forever. Think about the loss of your job and your family. Or maybe the standard answer goes like this. Don't go to places like that, or people will see you, and you'll lose all the opportunities for promotions in this world. Or stop engaging in those sexual immoralities, or you'll eventually catch a disease, and that might end up taking your life. Maybe what holds that person is they've heard, have you taken a long, hard look at what you're doing? It's so ugly. It's so repulsive. Or if you don't change your ways, your spouse may divorce you. Is that what you want? Are you sure it's worth it to risk losing your family and alienating your children? This is one I've heard. I know someone who walked down the same pathway as your own, and they ended up losing every friend they had. Last I heard, they died all alone with no one around to care for them or comfort them at all. Is that what you want? Now, let me be honest with you. Those will stop you for a little bit, but they won't make you pursue the treasure. They will not do that. They won't keep your heart away from it, because they are somewhat like the sirens of Greek mythology who keep calling you and luring you and pursuing you. I want to tell you about two guys, one named Ulysses, another named Jason. They're both Greek mythological guys, but they illustrate an incredible story and I think show us exactly in conclusion what kept Moses after those things and no care and love for the things of Egypt. And it's what will keep you. It's what will keep me, I do believe. This part of the Greek mythology that I want to share with you about these two guys have to do with those sirens. Remember, they are those demonic cannibal type creatures who through their seductivity and irresistible songs just lure you in, and once they get you in, they just destroy your life. And in Greek mythology, all the sailors were warned about the islands of the sirens, calling them and luring them. And when they would get to the shores, they would crash and it would kill them, and then they would be destroyed. In fact, some of you who've never read any Greek mythology at least do remember, "Oh, brother, where art thou," right? And you watch the movie. Remember when they were on the escape run? And one of the guys got sidetracked with the sirens who were singing and calling him, and they thought the poor fellow had been turned into a frog. You know, his clothes were laying there, you know. Well, in that humorous way, that is truly a picture of what the sirens did. They allured and they called people to themselves to kill and destroy their lives. And that's kind of what sin is like. It's not that there's no pleasure in it. It's just you don't think it's ever going to get you or capture you or catch you. So now that you got the picture, here's the story of two guys, Ulysses and Jason. Ulysses, who, as you read Greek mythology, also called Odysseus, is the one who you know had repeatedly been warned about the sirens and their lethal hypocrisy. So upon reaching the island, the story goes that he ordered his crew to put wax in their ears lest they would be lured to the ultimate demise. He commanded them to look neither to the left nor to the right, but to row for their very lives. Ulysses had other plans for himself. He instructed his men to strap him to the mast of the ship, leaving his ears unplugged. He said, I want to hear their song no matter what I say or do. Don't untie me until we are safely at a distance from the island. The songs of the sirens were more than Ulysses' otherwise strong will could resist. He was utterly seduced by their sound and mesmerized by the promise of immediate gratification. One siren even took on the form of Penelope, who was Ulysses' wife, seeking to lure him closer on the delusion that he had finally arrived home. Were it not for the ropes that held him tightly to the mast, Ulysses would have succumbed to their invitation. Although his hands were restrained, his heart was captivated by their beauty, and although his soul said yes, the ropes prevented his indulgence, his no was not the fruit of spontaneous revulsion, but the product of an external shackle, just something that held him in place. See, the point is Ulysses' encounter with the sirens together with the strategy for the resisting their appeal is all too familiar with how we try to deal with sin in our lives. It's like he's just like those who in their hearts are trying to run from the fleeting pleasures of sin. Your will, your restraints ultimately are not going to stop you. It's going to call you. So what is the most effective scheme for doing this? Well, let me introduce you to Jason. Jason, another mythological individual in the story, took a different approach. Jason brought with him on the treacherous journey a man named Orpheus. And Orpheus was a musician of incomparable talent, especially on the lyre and the flute. And when the music filled the air, it had this enchanting effect on all who heard. When it came time, Jason declined to plug the ears of his crew. He wasn't going to do like Ulysses did. Neither did he strap himself to the mast to restrain his otherwise lustful yearning for whatever pleasures the sirens might offer. Jason had no illusions about the strength of his will or his capacity to be deceived. He knew it was there. He was no less determined than Ulysses to resist the temptations of the sirens, but he chose a different thing. He ordered Orpheus to play his most beautiful and alluring songs. The sirens didn't stand a chance. Notwithstanding their collective allure, Jason and his men paid no heed to the sirens. They were not in the least inclined to succumb. Why? Was it that the sirens had ceased to sing? No. Was it that they had lost their capacity to entice the human heart? No, not at all. Jason and his men said no because they were captivated by a transcendent sound. The music of Orpheus was of altogether different and exalted nature. Jason and his men said no to the sounds of the sirens because they had heard something far more sublime. They had tasted something far sweeter. And here's my point. Ulysses may have survived the sound of the sirens, but only Jason really triumphed over them. Both of them obeyed in a manner of speaking. Neither succumbed, neither indulged their desires. Both men escaped the danger at hand, but only one was really changed. The vice grip, pleasure of sin exerts on the human soul is, I think, only broken by trusting God's promise of a superior pleasure of knowing Christ. So what's our options when it comes to the world that's luring us? We can restrain ourselves. We can say, no, I'm not. I promise, hold me accountable. All good in and of themselves. But in the end, your heart is not changed until you hear a sweeter, more glorious song. And that is Christ. A song that when we sing, all to Jesus, I surrender. We're really meaning that. It's you. It's all I want. Take my life and let me be consecrated wholly unto thee. It's so much falling in love with the truth of who he is revealed in his word. And as we gather together that you walk away and say, no matter how alluring that thing is, it's just not as satisfying as Christ. He far exceeds that. That's the kind of thing I hope you'll be talking about among yourselves and in your community groups, and you'll be considering really just how we do all struggle with the enticing pleasures of sin luring us. And we can stop it externally, but we'll never win the battle until we're transformed by a transcendent love and desire beyond that, which is Christ. Let's pray together.